I don't always shoot HDR, but when I do, I use one of 5 methods to process the image files: Photomatic's Nik HDR Pro, Photoshop HDR, or manual blending. The last one is maybe a concoction of 2 or sometimes all of those methods. Typically when I use Photomatic's Nik and Photoshop HDR, it's in scenes with a lot of complex detail, kind of like this swamp scene right here. Over the course of a series of videos, I'm going to show you how I utilize all the software in my workflow. But this video is about manual blending, and I want to show you how simple, powerful, and creative it can be. Here are the first 3 very basic steps to be made inside the library module in Lightroom. Number 1, you're going to select 2 of your bracketed image files. Number 2, make sure that you've done all the default raw edits to those files. I'll explain that more in just a second. And number 3, once you have those 2 image files selected, right-click on one of them and go down to Edit and then Open as Layers in Photoshop. Regarding step 2, you want to make some default edits to your raw files before going into Photoshop, or in this case, step 3. Now, if you've been to my workshops before, you'll notice that I do a lot of these things upon import. But if you haven't, here they are. Number 1 is detail. You want to go into detail and add sharpening and noise reduction. Now, you want to be specific about doing this in a certain way to your specific camera. Number 2 is lens correction. You want to go into basic and check both enable profile correction and remove chromatic aberration. Step 3 is camera calibration. Now, I use an X-Rite profiler, and because of that I have a specific profile for my D800 that I enable right here. If you do not have X-Rite or do not use that, I recommend the camera neutral profile. Okay? Also make sure that the process is set to current. Now, the last thing that's not going to be done inside preset is your white balance. I typically use the auto white balance inside the camera, but if that doesn't hit it perfectly, then I want to change it right here for the specific shot that I'm going to be sending over to Photoshop. The last thing you'll do is come down here to sync, and you'll sync it to the other file that you have chosen to use for manual blending. Okay, just so that we're in sync for this exercise, I recommend you go to Window, Workspace, and make sure you're in the Photography workspace. That way all these tools and tool panels will be in the same spot as what you see here on this video. Now, we just took 2 image files out of Lightroom, exported them, and opened them into Photoshop. And they show up here in the Layers palette. And I'm going to take the bottom one in this case and drag it to the top, because I always want, or I typically want, the darker image on top. You'll see why in just a minute. First step is to come down here to the bottom of the Layers palette and add a mask. And that will create this little white rectangle next to the image icon in the layer. Alright, and then we're going to choose the brush tool, which is over here in the tool panel, a third of the way down, or you can depress the B key on your keyboard. Now, the brush tool has some options, and the first one is up here in the upper left hand corner, and that dictates the size. It's this little slider here, as well as the hardness. Now, most of the time I keep the hardness at 0%. That just makes for an easier brush to work with, and you'll see why in just a minute. You also have opacity and flow. Keep flow at 100%, but you're going to be changing opacity with your keyboard. So you're going to use the 1 key for 10%, and the 2 key for 20%, and the 3 key for 30%, which is what I typically start with. And then I'm going to use the bracket key to make the brush bigger. And lastly, but not least, I'm going to check that my foreground color is black, and that's this little icon at the bottom of the tool panel here. That way it'll take away from this white mask. So if I hold the cursor over the bottom of the image and start painting, you can see what's happening. It's revealing a percentage of the lighter image below. And each time I click, it's going to reveal more of that brighter image. I'm going to go to 1% or 10% by clicking the 1 key and make a stroke right down this natural highlight of the dune right here. It wasn't enough, so I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do the same thing just in this little ridge in the foreground. Okay, you can kind of shape the light this way. Now this whole image looks a little flat, so what I'm going to do is come up here to the curves adjustments, and I'm going to add a little contrast to this whole scene. Now this is where it gets fun. If this gets certain areas too dark, you can come back to that original mask and change the size of your brush and maybe even the opacity. In this case I'm going to 20%. I'm just going to reveal a little bit of that lighter image below along the horizon. In fact, I'm going to make one more stroke until it looks about the right luminosity that I want. Last change I might make is this area looks a little dark, so I'll go to 1%, make the brush a little bit bigger, and do the same thing over here. Now I'm going to make it smaller, and I'm going to accentuate just the middle of the picture where that wind is blowing the sand off the top of the dune. And I'm going to do the same thing back here, just to give those highlights a little more luminosity. And I can do that in certain areas wherever I choose. That's what's fun about this method. Okay? Now, it's not completely done, but I have basically a new raw file. You can go in two directions from this point. You can either continue editing this picture in Photoshop, or you can simply save it, go back into Lightroom, and adjust it more with all the sliders that you may be more familiar with.